So, I'm Nigel Bigger. I'm standing here because I am chairman of the Faros Foundation. I'm also the Regius Professor Emeritus of Moral Theology in this university. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this year's Faros Spring Lecture. And it's my privilege to welcome and introduce our two speakers this evening. Our Faros lecturer is Sir Paul Marshall, one of the UK's leading investors, a major philanthropist, and now one of the country's most influential media owners. After spending the early part of his career at S.G. Warburg, he co-founded Marshall Wace, one of London's first hedge funds, in 1997. Sir Paul became heavily involved in educational philanthropy during the 2000s as the author of several books on British schools, as founding trustee of the children's charity ARK and chairman of ARC Schools, and as the leading non-executive director at the Department of Education between 2013 and 2016. His first venture into media was through the news website UnHerd in 2017. He later became a major investor in GB News before purchasing the Spectator in September last year. Formerly a major donor to the Liberal Democrats, Sir Paul left the party over its opposition to Brexit and his own commitment to classical liberalism. He's since supported the Conservative Party and was one of the founders, alongside Jordan Peterson, among others, of the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship in 2023. He is one of Britain's premier philanthropists, appearing in the top 10 of the Sunday Times Giving list just 2 days ago. And he was knighted for his services in 2016. After Sir Paul's lecture, Professor John Gray will engage him in conversation before concluding this event at 6:45, just so you know. For 20 years, John Gray was a professor in this university based at Jesus College, but he ended his formal academic career in 2008 as Professor of European Thought at the London School of Economics. Since then, he has published at least 7 books, so much for retirement, and has written widely in the press from UnHerd to The Guardian. But the apogee of all his achievements was surely his appearance in 2018 on Desert Island Discs. That is true, isn't it, John? Yes, okay. Apparently, he's also had an asteroid named after him, which is also true. Which is also true, yeah. All of us would like that to happen. But to borrow his joke, unfortunately, his thought hasn't had the impact he wanted it to have. He said that. John, you've done very good service on several Faros platforms to date, and we're delighted to have you back. And Sir Paul, we're delighted to have you with us to deliver the 2025 Faros Spring Lecture, Reflections on an Accidental Media Owner.
Thank you, Nigel. And first, may I just say what a privilege it is to come and speak to Faros, because you are innovators and disruptors, and you fight the fight for freedom. And therefore, you kind of do everything I like and want to support. It's also very exciting for me to be here because we're about 2 minutes' walk from where my parents met. They met, my father was at Wadham, and in the early 50s, they both played together in Midsummer Night's Dream, and that's where they fell in love. So it feels like I'm somewhat coming home. I personally was not happy at Oxford. I had probably the 3 most unhappy years of my life at Oxford because I was kind of totally caught up in metaphysical angst and quite lonely. But the The saving grace of my time at Oxford was my study of history, and in particular British history. And I fell in love with 19th century liberalism. All my adult life, I've been a classical liberal. I am with Mill in believing that free speech is a foundational good, and that freedom is a precondition of human flourishing. I am with Locke and Gladstone and Churchill in believing that there should always be a private realm beyond the reach of the state, where the experimental and innovative can be nurtured. And I am with Hayek, who recognized that the dispersed knowledge of millions will always be wiser than the concentrated and directing hand of one power. The title of this lecture is The Fatal Conceit. That is a reference to Hayek's great work on the follies of socialism and central control, a danger that applies as much, if not more, to the media as it does to economics. My subtitle, as Nigel mentioned, is Reflections of an Accidental Media Owner. That is because while I have spent most of my life in the world of markets, where I see liberal principles and Hayek's truths at play all the time, I have recently, and in an almost unplanned way, become the owner of a collection of media assets. And in so doing, I have discovered a set of illiberal practices and a dominating mindset which I believe need to be challenged. I will start by describing my media journey, then talk about some of the surprising discoveries I have made along the way, and then talk a little bit about today's evolving media landscape and what needs to be challenged. You could characterize my journey as a media owner as one of a frustrated consumer. In 2015, I was among many of those who had lost trust in the mainstream media. I subscribed to the words of Denzel Washington: "If you don't read newspapers, you are uninformed. If you do read the newspapers, you are misinformed." Newspapers and TV channels purported to be sources of record. They had strayed badly from that path. Most were simply conveyors of bias. The reasons for this are well chronicled. The advent of technology changed both the economics and the power distribution within the industry. Mainstream media started to chase eyeballs and subscribers, and many concluded that to build a viewer or subscriber base, it was more important to appeal to a particular tribe than to tell the truth. Sometimes telling the truth might upset your traditional readers. So much better to pander to their prejudices. Journalism became increasingly tribal. Truth was sacrificed, and so trust was lost. The death cross for mainstream media occurred somewhere around late 2020 and early 2021, when for the first time in the history of surveys how much people trusted the legacy media, a higher percentage of Americans responded not at all than responded a great deal or a fair amount. In the US, the three most successful broadsheets all sought to pander to the same narrow tribe, the metropolitan progressive. In the UK, it was different. The written media was, if anything, biased to the right. The Telegraph, Express, Mail, Sun were all explicitly on the right, with only The Guardian and The Mirror on the left. There was one exception, The Times. Its news pages sought to maintain an open-minded, centrist ground, and its opinion pages were deliberately heterodox. They presented opinion pieces each day from all sides of the political spectrum. As a hedge fund manager, I like my biases to be challenged. And so this became the first thing I read every day on the way to work, alongside Bloomberg Financial News and, of course, the Morning Star. It was always good to know what the people who think you should be hanged are saying. Anyway, when in 2016 the opinion editor of the Times, Tim Montgomery, resigned, I picked up the phone to him and suggested we created an independent online alternative, a daily heterodox opinion site. UnHerd met a need, and it now has over 3 million unique monthly views. John Gray has occasionally written for us. And this compares with 1.3 million for the New Statesman and just 200,000 for Tortoise, a rival site set up around the same time. About 5 years after the launch of UnHerd, I was approached by a new startup TV news channel about becoming an investor. I did not need to think very long about this. Mainstream TV in the UK suffered from all the same issues as the written press, but whilst the written press was marginally biased to the right, mainstream TV was uniformly biased to the metropolitan left. The BBC, Sky, ITV all fished more or less from the same pool of metropolitan journalists and produced the same predictable, progressive fare. Sky was the strangest one. Whilst Rupert Murdoch had previously carved out for it a strong market position, refreshingly free from left-wing bias, its new owners, Comcast, marinated in the waters of Philadelphia progressivism, decided to move it to the progressive left, effectively becoming a clone of the BBC. Post the George Floyd killing, they went further than even the BBC, actively promoting the Marxist organization Black Lives Matter across their sporting programs. Now, the good thing about all this is that it created a huge blank space for a news channel on the center-right or even just the common sense center ground. This meant that in commercial terms, GB News could make many technical errors in its early days and still gain very significant audience share. As anyone who followed it from the beginning will confirm, we did both. But those teething problems are well and truly behind us. Today, we are neck and neck with Sky and frequently also beat the BBC in daily viewers, BBC News Channel. My prediction is that in 2028, Sky will drop out of regular news coverage in the UK once Comcast's 10-year commitment to subsidize UK news under the 2018 agreement expires. And we will be left with two dominant news channels, the BBC, representing the centre-left, and GB News, representing the centre-right. That, of course, raises questions about the BBC because, according to its charter, it is not supposed to be biased. But more of that later. I've described the landscape into which I ventured, hoping to provide platforms for alternative voices and viewpoints. I was not wholly naive. I recognized that the incumbents and their allies in the broader world of the progressive left would not necessarily welcome challenge. What I was frankly unprepared for was the determined, organized, devious nature of the opposition I would face. This is where I would now like to turn, starting with the experiences of UnHerd. My first exposure to malpractice was my encounter with the phenomenon of shadow banning. From the earliest days of the COVID lockdown, UnHerd's editor, Freddie Sayers, took a cautious approach to the politicization of what was called the science. He explored the Swedish approach, and UnHerd was the first media outlet in this country to fairly cover the arguments behind the Great Barrington Declaration, which challenged the generally adopted approach to COVID-19 and particularly lockdown policy. In the UK, one of the most articulate voices in challenging the lockdown consensus was Lord Sumption, the former Supreme Court Justice, former lecturer at Pharos. Freddie decided to interview him. The interview went viral and received over 250,000 views within 24 hours. Then suddenly, the views stopped dead. A few months later, we learned from a source at Google that YouTube had intentionally reduced, in their parlance, the video and the whole channel to dampen the spread of the video. The technical term for this is algorithmic visibility demotion. It is more frequently known as shadow banning. Welcome to the world of American big tech. As we have subsequently discovered, all through this period, companies like Google, Facebook, and pre-Musk Twitter were regularly lent upon by government to suppress or hide information that was unwelcome to the government narrative. COVID saw perhaps peak algorithmic visibility demoting. But COVID was very far from the only arena where this practice occurred. In 2020, the determination among many to ensure that Joe Biden beat Donald Trump meant stories about Hunter Biden's laptop and the evidence of possible corruption which it contained were deliberately suppressed. This was a very direct interference by state agencies through the social media platforms to influence the outcome of a presidential election. Shadow banning is one small manifestation of the much wider phenomenon of what has been called the misinformation industry. In January 2024, UnHerd became aware of an organization called the Global Disinformation Index, which purports to be an anti-misinformation service and had placed UnHerd on its dynamic exclusion list, which meant that they were recommending it should be boycotted by advertisers. The justification? Some of the site's authors were dubbed anti-trans, in particular, Kathleen Stock, Julie Bindel, and Debbie Hayton. Now, Kathleen Stock and Julie Bindel are award-winning journalists. Debbie Hayton is actually transgender. The GDI were classifying gender-critical beliefs or maintaining that biological differences exist as disinformation. Thanks to the campaigning of brave women and the judgment of the Supreme Court, we now know that what the GDI called disinformation is now the law of the land and established scientific fact. The GDI rating of UnHerd meant that we only received between 2 and 6% of the ad revenue normally expected for an audience our size. The GDI was founded in 2018. It received money from the Open Society Foundation, the UK government, the EU, the German Foreign Office, and USAID. They defined disinformation as anything that deployed an adversarial narrative. In an interview in 2021, the founder, Claire Melford, explained how this included anything that they deemed harmful or divisive. In other words, anything that she found offensive. Misinformation identified by the GDI included what they called the Wuhan lab conspiracy theory, any challenge to the official narrative around vaccine efficacy, and the support of the notion that there are only 2 biological sexes. You can be in no doubt that if the GDI had been around in the 17th century, they would have found Copernicus harmful and Galileo positively offensive. The GDI only represents a tiny fraction of the misinformation industry. It has recently been revealed by the Free Press that the Biden administration made more than 600 grants to misinformation nonprofits in its 4 years. Tackling disinformation sounds like a responsible thing to do, but unfortunately, most of the disinformation agents who seek to track sites or individuals under the misinformation rubric have an explicit or near explicit left-wing agenda. This very much includes BBC Verify, which is frankly an abuse of taxpayer money and should be shut down. The advent of social media has led to other new and innovative forms of abuse in relation to news and opinion. And this brings me to the issue of social media harassment and the experiences of GB News. In the past 15 years, many campaigning groups have sprung up in this country and around the West who have understood the new power provided by social media for a very small number of voices to have disproportionate influence. In this, they are really no different from schoolyard bullies. The internet is their playground, and they use playground tactics to marshal swarms of trolls against their targeted victims. Examples of people who operate in this way in this country include Stop Funding Hate, Hope Not Hate, and Led by Donkeys. In the United States, there are multitudes led by Antifa. They are overwhelmingly on the left, and you will notice their cynical use of branding. They are rarely for anything. They are just against something that we can all agree is bad: hate, racism, fascism, and so on. The irony is that it is these people who are frequently the ones acting in the most hateful ways themselves. What they have understood very well is that corporate and institutional boards hate political controversy. Most leaders of businesses are not particularly political. They are concerned with the bottom line. Boards want to stay well clear of what is called brand risk, and so err towards moral cowardice. So they will line up behind DEI if that is what the Democrats want, and they will line up against DEI if that is what Donald Trump wants. In 2020, before GB News had even launched, a campaign against them was begun by Stop Funding Hate. Stop Funding Hate was founded in 2016 by a small group of Corbynistas led by Richard Cameron Wilson. They are mainly leftovers from the Momentum movement with low personal profiles seeking to harass corporates and institutions. The right name for this organization is not Stop Funding Hate, but Stop Funding People We Hate. Early in 2020, just before the GB News launch, Stop Funding People We Hate started to send multiple letters to advertising agencies and to corporates, warning them that GB News would be right-wing and extremist. Most of the letters have a standard format, and a surprisingly large number were authored by a lady called Helen Trim. And if you are a CEO assailed with letters of this kind, the prudent thing to do is to withdraw your advertising and wait and see. And that is what happened. Prior to launch date, GB News had a full roster of blue-chip advertisers. In the first 24 hours, many of them succumbed to the Stop Funding People We Hate pressure and pulled the plug. For a couple of years, it took a brave corporate CEO to advertise on GB News. But two things have happened. First of all, our audience share has grown so strongly that it can't be ignored. And secondly, we have developed a remarkable fan club. So recently, when Marks and Spencer's decided to advertise on GB News and receive the usual letters and social media insults, they also received a barrage of support from GB News fans, saluting them for their principled and sensibly commercial decision to advertise with us. Today, it would be an unwise CEO who did not advertise with GB News. Now, I'm not suggesting we use the power of the state to shut down or censor organizations like Stop Funding People We Hate. After all, I am not a left-wing progressive. They are entitled to free speech, but I am asking advertisers and corporates to be aware of what is going on here. They are basically succumbing to the pressure of the playground bully. Now, advertising is very important to GB News. It is the main source of our revenues, as it is for all terrestrial TV channels. And the main driver of advertising revenues is audience share. So you would think it was pretty important that we had an accurate way of measuring audience share. We don't. In fact, we have the opposite. And this brings me to the second problem GB News has encountered. In the UK, TV audience share is measured by an organisation called BARB, the Broadcast Audience Research Board. The data provided by BARB drives a £2.5 billion advertising market. BARB is jointly owned by the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, Sky, and the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising. In other words, most of the companies who stand to win or lose from the TV market share measured by BARB own BARB. It is a bit like having the company responsible for managing VAR being owned by the 5 most long-established Premiership clubs. Now, I'm a Manchester United fan, so I might actually be in favour of that right now, because it would just about be the only way we could recover to our former position in the Premiership. But I think most people would agree it is just a little bit vulnerable to abuse. That is not the only problem. There is the small issue of data collection and sample size. BARB have reporting boxes in some 7,000 homes. The method behind the sampling is completely invisible to us, and we have no idea whether it is reliable. What we do know is that the data jumps about every day and is remarkably erratic. At GB News, we have a running joke that our daily viewing numbers depend on whether Brian and Enid have switched on up in Macclesfield. In the digital age, this method of data collection is prehistoric, and it is about as reliable as Spanish electricity. At the very least, we need complete transparency on the data and the collection process and on the identity of the panelists. We don't have it. The other important part of the UK's institutional framework is, of course, Ofcom. I respect Ofcom, but I also feel sorry for them. They face a daily onslaught of complaints, many of them orchestrated by the likes of Stop Funding People We Hate. Understandably, Ofcom find it difficult, just like other corporate and institutional boards, to resist the pressures from left-wing campaigning groups. And this has led them to initiate many more inquiries into GB News than could be justified. In 2024, Ofcom received 3,775 complaints about GB News. This represented about 2% of the TV total. We have asked them how many of these complaints were from serial complainers, i.e. orchestrated by campaigning groups. They refused to say. In 2024, a total of 40 breach notices were issued by Ofcom. 6 of them were related to GB News, so 15% of the total, compared to 2% of the breaches. 2 of these breaches were quashed in the High Court after we decided to take legal action, and 3 others have now been cancelled by Ofcom as a result of the High Court judgment. Our intention, of course, is to have as constructive a relationship as possible with our regulator. But they sit within a framework full of anomalies, and they are steadily assailed by invective from left-wing activists. So it is not easy for them to resist the biases of metropolitan opinion. If they were interested in an impartial and pluralistic media, they should be worried much more about the BBC than about GB News. And that brings me to by far the biggest regulatory anomaly in UK media. As everyone knows, the UK state broadcaster is the dominant player in TV, with an audience share at the end of last year of 32%. They are funded by the licence fee, whereas other channels, such as ours, are funded by private money. This should mean that they are held to a higher standard of impartiality. They are not. The BBC are held to a lower standard of impartiality than any other channel, in one extraordinary respect, which is that they are allowed to mark their own homework. When a complaint is made to the BBC, about the BBC, it must be considered under a process known as BBC First, under which Ofcom can only consider complaints where the complainant has completed the BBC complaints process first. So even after the BBC received over 500 complaints about their documentary Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone, starring the son of a Hamas terrorist, the BBC have been allowed to conduct their own investigation into the programme before Ofcom even get involved. You couldn't make it up. The BBC is allowed to decide whether any complaint against it is justified before it is escalated to the regulator. Imagine the outcry if that privilege were granted to GB News, or to any other channel for that matter. If you don't mind, I would like to digress a little bit further on the BBC. For the BBC squats like a giant toad in the middle of the UK media landscape, an embodiment of anti-competitive market distortion, as well as the source of many of the worst cases of media bias. The BBC is a remarkable institution. Created in 1922, it deservedly earned an unparalleled status during World War II, not only as a unique source of truth, but also for the people of Europe as a beacon of hope and freedom. But now the BBC is 103 years old, and like any enduring institution, it has increasingly succumbed to Robert Conquest's second law of politics. Any organisation not explicitly right-wing, sooner or later, becomes left-wing. The majority of the BBC's 21,000 staff are very decent people. However, like any institution, the BBC has found it difficult to manage the natural biases of its intake, drawn overwhelmingly from the metropolitan, progressive, university-educated classes anchored in the safe precincts of North and West London and Manchester. Unfortunately for the BBC, the advent of social media has laid these biases bare for all to see. Gary Lineker in particular, but also a number of other high-profile left-wing staff or former staff, have done a great deal of damage to the BBC brand by putting their personal interests above those of their employer. And BBC management has been weak in dealing with the problem. One of the most egregious areas of bias within the BBC is the corporation's Arabic service. We are currently awaiting the results of their internal investigation into the BBC Arabic reporter who posted, "We will burn Jews like Hitler did." I wonder which aspect of the post they're taking so long to deliberate over. Is it burning, or Jews, or Hitler? But the argument about BBC bias, of course, goes much deeper than social media posts. Bias is usually viewed through the lens of impartiality of treatment, making sure that viewers always hear both sides of an argument. Impartiality of this kind was more or less abandoned during Brexit and then again in COVID. But just as important as the impartiality of treatment is the question of bias in topic selection. And this is something that does not get anywhere near the right attention. Before GB News came along, there were many important topics that were almost entirely ignored by mainstream media and the BBC. One of these was illegal immigration. This is something that enrages many Britons. But for the BBC staff, many of them unwittingly committed to the ideologies of post-colonial theory, multiculturalism, and open borders, it is a highly inconvenient topic. Before GB News started covering the issue, you were more likely to hear from the BBC about the effect of climate change on the mating habits of mollusks in the English Channel than you were to hear about illegal channel crossings. Even more inconvenient for the BBC is the issue of grooming gangs. The systematic grooming and rape of teenage white girls on an industrial scale by mostly Pakistani heritage men is one of the biggest scandals in British post-war history. Yet the BBC coverage has been minimal. When the court verdict on the Telford grooming gangs was announced, at the time the largest grooming scandal to come to trial, with over 1,000 girls systematically abused, there was no mention at all on the main news channel. You would have to go to the local BBC Shropshire page and scroll down to the third story. Why is this? It is one of the purposes of the media to uncover scandals, and I hope the BBC itself would now admit it has failed spectacularly when it comes to reporting on the terrible tale of thousands of young, working-class girls being trafficked, raped, and in some cases murdered. I would go further and say that it is all part of a picture where, as an organization, it has repeatedly neglected stories of relevance to ordinary working-class families in favor of subjects which align with its own metropolitan biases. In some cases, that bias is trivial, but when it comes to the rape gangs, I believe it is itself a scandal. As a result, the BBC is rapidly losing viewers. In 2024, 650,000 people cancelled their licence fee, a useful data point for the competition. So what should be done about the BBC? One answer is simply to accept that the BBC should be sold off. As long as the BBC remains a ward of the state, it will continue to be the propaganda arm of the state, who are ultimately its paymasters. In 2025, however, this is unhealthy and unnecessary. Alternatively, if the BBC is to continue to be funded through the licence fee, It needs to deal decisively with the bias problem. In my view, the BBC should be broken up between, on the one hand, the public service elements of news, education, documentaries, and on the other, the rest, entertainment, drama, sport. The latter should be privatized and allowed to compete with other entertainment companies. The public service part should have a unique regulatory status, but the standard should be higher, not lower, than that applied to other channels. Regulation of impartiality should cover both topic selection and treatment, and the BBC first process for reviewing complaints should be removed entirely. To the extent that the BBC continues to be funded by the licence fee, the only impartiality that should be allowed, even encouraged, is that it should be expected to be patriotic, to love our country and to support its traditions. The BBC stopped playing the national anthem in 1997, shortly after the accession of the Blair government. This is the point at which patriotism was quietly erased from its mission, and it began to lose its way. It is very telling that GB News decided correctly that it could gain commercial advantage by playing the national anthem every morning at 6 a.m. This expectation of patriotism should be built into the BBC Charter, which currently has a separate section on diversity, introduced in 2016, but nothing on patriotism. I would now like to turn to the media landscape more broadly. Before I do so, please allow me to step back and, as befits this venue, to be a little philosophical. It is always dangerous to make binary distinctions as they are oversimplistic, but in the debate over free speech and censorship, it can be a helpful starting place. For in this debate, there are really two alternative poles. At one end of the spectrum are those who prefer to embrace the noise of the public square and trust the people to ensure that truth will emerge from the cauldron. This is the preferred model of Elon Musk and the free speech absolutists. At the other end of the spectrum is rule by censorship, with truth determined and safeguarded by a narrow and self-appointed group of experts. At the free speech end of the spectrum, you run the risk of giving voice to insalubrious characters and bad ideas. At the censorship end of the spectrum, you also run the risk of bad ideas, but you couple that with the clear danger of giving excessive powers to a small and unaccountable cadre of bureaucrats. Both models produce bad ideas, but the censorship model is much more dangerous as it can lead to bad ideas, like excessive lockdowns or net zero, gaining much more extensive and dangerous sway. Belief in a self-appointed cadre who should make decisions on our behalf is nothing new and has deep philosophical roots, which arguably go all the way back to Plato. Plato had reservations about Athenian democracy. He felt that the majority were not educated or intelligent enough to rule themselves well, and that politics required experts like him and just rulers who should be carefully selected and trained. One person who understood the dangers of this approach was Frederick Hayek. In his final book, The Fatal Conceit, written in 1988, he draws a distinction between socialism and markets. Socialism, he said, assumes that all the available knowledge can be used by a single central authority. It overlooks that modern society is based on the utilization of widely dispersed knowledge of millions of men. Hayek's argument was deployed primarily in the realm of economics, and he harkened back to Adam Smith and his notion of the invisible hand, which in the economic sphere relies on a model of dispersed knowledge rather than centralized knowledge to deliver the best outcomes. This notion of dispersed knowledge transfers very well to the sphere of free speech, and that is because the roots of the idea lie even deeper in the domain of epistemology and how we know things. One of the most important foundational ideas of Friedrich Hayek was that of epistemic modesty. He recognized that no individual or group, however brilliant, can be all-knowing. A particular phrase that Hayek used to describe the fatal conceit was the presumption of reason. Hayek was not against what he termed reason properly used, but rather against its naive and uncritical use, against the reliance on axiomatic thinking or biased assumptions, and against the making of excessive claims on shaky foundations. He would not, I think, have been a fan of the OBR. He was particularly opposed to what he called scientism, which he described as a false theory of science and rationality in which reason is abused, and which he traced back to Descartes. He was in that respect very much a supporter of the Scottish Enlightenment and against the French Enlightenment. One of his most telling remarks was that intelligent people will tend to overvalue intelligence. I hesitate to invoke this particular quote at Oxford University, which is of course full of very intelligent people. But the observation applies well beyond the dreaming spires of Oxford. We live in an age when roughly 50% of the Western population go to university, and the other 50% do not. Those who go to university overvalue the fact that they're good at passing exams, and they equate it, rightly or wrongly, with intelligence. They also equate it, entirely wrongly, with superior levels of moral intelligence or wisdom. I'm afraid the exam passing classes are just as subject to motivated reasoning as everyone else, perhaps even more so. Indeed, it is notable that all through our history, it is more often than not, and especially in the 1930s, the working men and women who have shown the real wisdom when our governing classes have lost the plot. Burke referred to this as the wisdom of unlettered men. Over the last 30 years, the exam passing classes, who tend to occupy most of the senior positions in the government and the bureaucracy, have delivered a long catalogue of policy failures, from China's accession to the WTO, to COVID lockdowns, from unrestricted open borders to net zero. They have embraced and implemented policies which may have suited their own interests, but which were often against the interests of what that great exam passer Hillary Clinton called the deplorables. And these bad policies have been enforced by a vigorous application of scientism and censorship, using the authority of so-called experts to close down discussion. This is a comparatively recent phenomenon. According to Google Trends, worldwide searches for the term disinformation quadrupled between June and December 2016, and then increased by more than 30 times by 2022. This new model of information control has been dubbed the cathedral, ruled by an ideologically aligned network of politicians, journalists, academics, NGOs, permanent bureaucracy, internet trolls, all seeking to ensure that people fall into line behind a prescribed narrative. In the cathedral, the social media platforms like Facebook, Google, and Twitter pre-Musk are the spires. The trolling organizations like Stop Funding People We Hate are the gargoyles, ugly demons on the side of the cathedral doing the dirty work. This approach to media governance is not about finding or protecting the truth. It is all about narrative control. And it is highly self-serving. Isn't it curious how the people who are the biggest advocates of censorship and controlled narrative are always include themselves amongst the people who should be exercising the control? From Plato through to Hillary Clinton, from Nick Clegg, Alan Rusbridger, and the Facebook Oversight Board, all the way to Ursula von der Leyen and Thierry Breton. Ursula von der Leyen recently likened misinformation to a virus. In fact, it is censorship that is the virus, and free speech is the vaccine. Hayek knew what he was doing when he employed the term conceit. As we know, it has a double meaning. It is arrogance that is the fatal flaw of the censorship class. The arrogance to believe that their worldview is superior to that of others. They are no more immune to motivated reasoning than anyone else. Censorship is simply the means to enforce their own biases. Manipulation of information creates a society where trust is eroded, conspiracies thrive, and shared perceptions crumble. I fear that is pretty much where we have been heading in the last 10 years. Arguably, post the Trump election, there are some cracks beginning to appear in the cathedral. We have entered the age, for example, of the independent podcast. The leading US podcaster, Joe Rogan, has a regular podcast audience 28 times larger than primetime CNN. This new podcast world is dominated by larger-than-life personalities like Joe Rogan, Candace Owens, the Young Turks, and Tucker Carlson. It has its own currency, as Konstantin Kisin recently pointed out, where the key attributes for success are transgression, charisma, and conspiracy. And it has its own tribes. Now, whilst this increased pluralism is healthy, it brings new dangers. Because it grew up largely in opposition to the censorship-controlled cathedral model, the alternative media world is largely populated by the right, and it traffics heavily in conspiracy theories, which are what their audiences often love to hear. There is very little editorial control. The big podcast personalities are their own editors, with no one to challenge or fact-check them. Their only accountability is to their audience, and so we have podcasters like Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson giving airtime to discredited amateur historians like Darryl Cooper, who tells us that Winston Churchill was the chief villain of World War II and was funded by Zionist Jewish bankers. The dangers of this new ecosystem are clear. Unless we are careful, conspiracy theories will multiply. Truth will be sacrificed even more in the quest for eyeballs, and tribal conflict will become ever more dominant. So how do we preserve our standards? The key overriding principle for me is to ensure that there is a golden thread of responsibility and accountability running through everything, whether that be the platforms, the publishers, or self-publishing individuals. Just like free market capitalism depends on a sense of virtue and personal responsibility amongst its practitioners to function well and deliver prosperity, so a free and pluralistic media depends on the same thing. Unfortunately, a very large and important part of our media industry is now out of Britain's control because of the dominance of US-owned platforms. But I would venture a couple of proposals to our American friends. Firstly, social media platforms like X, Blue Sky, or Meta should be required to publish all the algorithms which they use to analyze or influence our preferences. Elon Musk believes in open source and transparency for manufacturing. He should do the same for X. We should all be able to know how the algorithms work, which place certain stories and characters in our timeline and not others. Secondly, social media platforms should be regulated as common carriers. Under the current Section 230 provisions, they have been exempted from any of the responsibilities of a traditional publisher. They have power without responsibility. Effectively, those who post are treated as publishers, so much so that in illiberal countries like Britain, you can be jailed for a Facebook post. The platforms cannot be held to account for what is published, yet they still enjoy many of the powers of a publisher. In particular, they can manipulate the salience of posts through algorithms or even suspend accounts, even that of President Trump. This is wrong, and platforms need to have less power and more accountability. At the very least, there need to be constraints around them, such as you would impose on a bank or a railroad. They should not be allowed to refuse or suspend accounts or to actively demote the visibility of a post, unless it is in clear breach of the law. Texas and Florida both recently tried to introduce legislation to this effect. Although the legislation was blocked in the Supreme Court, I believe and hope it will return in due course, even if in a slightly diluted form. Turning to the UK, we are actually fortunate to have a relatively pluralistic newspaper landscape, with multiple voices represented on left and right. GB News has broken the progressive monopoly in TV news, and the emergence of multiple new alternative media voices will also be healthy. However, the continued dominance of the BBC is unhealthy, both with regard to the economic challenges it poses for new entrants and to the problem of the progressive bias within the BBC, which has become increasingly entrenched over the past 25 years. The BBC needs to be held to a higher, not lower, standard of impartiality than the other channels, reflecting the nature of its funding. And we need to remove completely its other privileges, as I have set out. Ownership of media assets, whether it applies to traditional publications or what you might call sole traders, is a sacred trust. We all need to hold ourselves to a high standard of responsibility, which means a dedication to telling the truth as far as we see it, but also a willingness to challenge untruths and to challenge narratives which are misleading. This applies as much to podcasters like Joe Rogan as it does to TV anchors, arguably even more so. A free, pluralistic, healthy media is a cornerstone of a free society. We have to be truth tellers. That means we have to be a thorn in the side of the consensus, or we are nothing. George Orwell used to say that the essence of journalism is printing what someone does not want printed. Everything else is public relations. This is my mantra for UnHerd, for GB News, and for the Spectator. It is not a mantra for left or right, but for truth and courage. Truth and courage, but in a spirit and framework of responsibility. Hopefully, in that way, we can all make our contribution to the public good and to a freer society in which every voice is heard and respected, and where conceit is left at the door. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that inspiring, invigorating, and challenging speech. I learned an immense amount from it about the media landscape, about what was done to strangle GB News at birth and to do the same to UnHerd before that. I didn't know that full story. And I learned a great deal also about the ways in which the commercial and financial interests of rival organizations animated their attempt to close down this part of what one leading former Sky journalist called a part of the ecology which was of the media which was damaging the rest and therefore should be cut off and destroyed. But as a philosopher, I suppose I was most interested in what you said towards the end and at the very end about the importance of truth-telling, because it struck me that when you mentioned the phrase, the cathedral, that what has been constructed in Western liberal or ex-liberal societies has been a set of institutions which channels and monitors and censors and truth, that has not only a commercial or a financial or a political aspect, but a religious aspect, a cathedral. And Hayek, you mentioned John Stuart Mill there, but Hayek thought that classical liberalism went wrong in John Stuart Mill. And one of the reasons it did, apart from Mill's ambiguities about socialism, was that Mill wanted to replace Abrahamic religion, particularly Christianity, by what he called the religion of humanity, which he'd gained from the French positivist thinker Auguste Comte, immensely influenced by him. And I think the key thing there I'd like to explore with you is whether what it lies behind this cathedral is not so much a belief that it possesses self-evident or final truth, but a disbelief in truth. That's to say, if you believe in truth, and I think our Western idea of truth, the one we operate with coming from Plato and Christianity, is that it's independent of human will, of the human mind, so that there are such things as facts. And if we didn't have this idea, we wouldn't really have an idea of bias, because what would we be screening out if there's only what we create? And I think that's one of the most frightening features, actually, of this situation that we find ourselves in, which is that what members of this progressive elite believe is that truth is power. So if they can shut us up, if they can intimidate us, if they can freeze you out, as they try to do in your case, then it's not that truth has been suppressed, it's that they've created their own truth. And I had to go back then to that really terrifying moment in George Orwell's 1984, when the torturer asks Winston Smith, do you believe in God? The torturer thought that unless you believed in God, there couldn't be an idea of truth independent of the human mind. Is that a belief of yours?
That's a huge question, obviously.
Obviously.
An easy one to start. First of all, I actually hesitated to cite Mill, almost for the reason you mentioned. Even on the way up, I thought, should I focus on Milton, who was a bit more obvious, or another advocate of free speech, because I don't particularly like the rest of Mill, particularly kind of the homo economicus aspect of Mill. A big part of the speech was about the nature of truth, and I do think that that's one of the biggest problems we have as a society now. And there's there are at least three approaches to it. One is the kind of, I highlighted the difference and Hayek was focused on empirical truth and rationalistic truth, obviously the British way is empirical truth. And then, of course, what you're also referring to is the kind of postmodern attitude to truth, which is that there is no truth, and that the truths are just the imposition of power structures and so on, as you say. And I do think that a lot of the fights that are happening today are to do with that battle. And the difficulty of winning arguments also is the very weak hold that truth has on society. I don't think it's necessarily linked to faith, except that postmodernism is pretty hostile to faith, because it says everything is relative. There is no empirical truth, and it's probably difficult to hold that together with a belief in God. Although I think it's quite possible actually there will be people who emerge who do hold that type of faith in God, which is a rather less grounded faith in God.
It's linked to an idea, is it not, of humankind or of the human agent as being godlike.
Absolutely.
And that's what atheism was in late 19th century Russia, which generated these terrorists and communists. It wasn't the belief that there is no God, it was the belief that human beings could become gods or godlike. Back to the... and the problem with that is that, from the point of view of your lecture today, is that without the idea of truth, we have no use for doubt.
Yeah.
And without the idea of truth, opinion or judgment becomes entirely tribal, as you say. So it's a competition, it's a power competition.
Yes.
So the most ruthless, the most devious, the most unscrupulous are the ones who actually make truth. Yeah. And so to that extent, I think what you're describing the deep solution to the problem of that the post-liberal societies are in, or the ex-liberal societies are in, has to do with, let's put it politically, weakening the power of the antinomian intelligentsia in all parts of society, not just the media, but centrally in the media, and certainly in universities. It actually involves, dare I say it here, a shrinkage in universities, at least as in the form that they become. As a 19th century German, not Nietzsche, wrote, universities are becoming factories of ignorance. they're producing people with systematically false beliefs. The only way you can do that maybe is by a kind of disestablishment of universities,
Yes. Yeah.
being attempted in perhaps a rather rough manner by Trump at the moment.
I've got a couple of reactions to that. First of all, it is almost certainly the case, whether it's just intuitively or explicitly, that the progressive left, who basically, I would say, embrace a postmodernist epistemology, that's how they think about things, they are, as you say, therefore very likely to see the contest of public ideas as about control of the narrative in a much more intentional way than we've ever done before, whereas naive people like me think it's still about trying to find the truth. And if you're less concerned about finding the truth and more concerned simply about imposing your narrative, you then resort to all the weapons you can possibly find to make your narrative dominant. And I'm, if you like, maybe stuck in a world where I actually still trust empirical truth. So, and the framework that I 100% believe in biases, and we were talking about it in my work. You do a lot of work on people's biases as fund managers. And therefore, I believe in every argument, you've got to find the motivation of the other person. But I see that within a kind of empirical, truth-based framework, rather than in a postmodern narrative-based framework, which I think is creates an incredibly toxic basis for society, because you can never really, if you can't agree that there is an empirical truth that you can arrive at, there's no point even engaging, because you're not
point in argument.
Yeah, yeah.
This brings up another large question that you raised about classical liberalism, and explains the doubt you had about including Mill, which is that classical liberalism, as it was developed in England, and perhaps in other countries as well, but certainly in England, was a byproduct of a certain type of theism. Yes. In fact, a byproduct of a certain type of Christianity. Does it therefore depend, so to speak, on, does the reversal of these trends towards illiberal liberalism, anti-liberal liberalism, progressive liberalism, depend upon a revival of a Christian, or at least a theistic idea of a reality, a spiritual reality, independent of the human mind, of human beings? I mean, one of the great texts I just should mention, because I would love you all to read it if you haven't read it, is C.S. Lewis's short pamphlet called The Abolition of Man, which began as a lecture during the Second World War. He thinks it's not necessarily true that it has to be Christianity or even monotheism. He mentions Chinese Taoism as well. He said, but without the idea of a way, an order, something in the world which is wholly independent of human judgment, which in the end human judgment must submit to, we're lost. Then there's only will, then there's only power, and then there's no truth. Yes. Do you share that view?
Up to a point. So I believe very strongly that classical liberalism grew out of Christian faith, as you say, of a Christian framework, and that today liberalism, the problem with liberalism is that it's lost its moorings, and that's why it doesn't work. But I think it's unlikely that you can rediscover the kind of classical liberalism that I loved without a spiritual renewal and so on. However, just listening to you, if I think about what went wrong, essentially I think it's that people took from Christianity a focus on rights, and they forgot about responsibility. There are many philosophers you can identify who focused on rights, and that's what's become secularized. There are virtually, you tell me, virtually no philosophers who you want to associate with responsibility, and it's the responsibility stream which is the key thing that's been lost from Christianity, our duty to others.
Some Catholic social theologians.
Exactly, that's why Catholic social teaching has such an important role to play. And so I would say that Jordan Peterson is one of the first philosophers of responsibility. That's his success really is, that he teaches responsibility. And that's why he's so popular, particularly with young men. And so and maybe that there's a hope there, but maybe there needs to be a bigger equivalent of Locke, or rules in the world of responsibility, and that would restore a balance to what's been taken from Christianity. But at the moment, over 200 years, there's been virtually nobody who's been the philosopher who provided that cornerstone and that foundation.
Final question, since we're running out of time. I guess one basic concern we all have is whether liberalism in some kind of classical form, the old-fashioned liberalism of toleration and truth-seeking and responsibility, was a phase in universal human development or a happy accident.
Yeah.
And I guess the problem I see, which perhaps you could respond to this, is that just as climate change, as you've analysed climate change as a collective action problem, if you've got people in the world who are ignoring emissions and pumping out enormous amounts of them, then any one state which tries to be virtuous just ruins itself, and which I think is pretty well what's happening. But it could be that liberalism in an illiberal world is something like that. So, for example, free trade in a world that contains, that's just the economic side of that, contains Xi's mercantilism and Trump's protectionism, could be a suicidal move. And unless you have lots of restraints against illiberal powers penetrating your own institutions, as has undoubtedly happened, foreign powers, you can go under, but those are dangerous to some extent. They involve curbing important freedoms. I mean, in a sense, I'm assuming that we understand something about this, that we have some grasp on this strange world that we've entered with Trump, where when I watch television now and see people parsing his statements, I'm reminded of academic critics interpreting Finnegan's Wake. It's not clear that there is some underlying meaning there.
Yeah.
Certainly not a consecutive meaning or one which extends beyond one statement to the next or one word to the next. But we're in a world in which liberalism could easily become a kind of victim of a coordination problem. That is to say, if people stick to their liberal principles, they could go under. Now, this is not a comment on what you've said about the media. It's a comment on whether one can have a liberal part of the world or a liberal bloc when the rest of the world is actively illiberal.
Is actively
Illiberal.
Yes. Well, that, I mean, 100% you can, because in the Second World War, basically it was liberal democracy versus fascism, and there are three separate ideologies. And I still believe that a liberal democratic model can...
And it was extraordinarily liberal, actually.
Yes, and we didn't retain enough of a recognition of that. I thought you were going in a different direction, which is an interesting. So I want to just respond to what I thought was a different direction, which whether liberalism is capable of collective action.
Yes.
And I actually, because arguably people say, well, liberalism is too individualistic and it doesn't worry about the common good and the wider good, which is a challenge. Now, I personally think that actually liberalism did find that answer, which was people like T.H. Green, the Christian philosophers in the late 19th century who understood that government, and they called it social liberalism, which now has a different meaning, but in those days, social liberalism meant the government taking responsibility for education and welfare, and that liberal government in 1906 to 14 was the founder of the welfare state in this country and made huge progress in education. And I think they'd actually found that beautiful blend. Going back to my early, what I learned, this is what I focused on at university. And then it was all blown up by the personalities of Lloyd George and Asquith, so it's all blown apart. But there could have been a basis on which liberalism would have thrived in this country on that basis, but it's been lost.
But in a sense, by chance, because those two personalities were contingent. They needed to be there.
Totally.
That's what we should think of. I think Hegel said somewhere that I think in 1806 at Jena, just before the Battle of Jena, which wiped out the Prussian army, he said, seeing Napoleon was seeing history, the Weltgeist, world history on horseback. We're now watching history on a golf cart going through all of our assumptions about the future with one personality. But if it's as contingent as that, if it's as contingent as Lloyd George and Asquith were, then there's no reason to despair because there are lots of other contingencies around. We abound in contingencies, and I think that's one of many rich lessons I've learned tonight from Paul's talk and our conversation. Thank you very much, Paul.